A very warm welcome to the new episode of Ink and Insights. This is your host Sumit Sharma Samir. If you are interested in listening to the thought leaders from around the world, please subscribe to my channel. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Emma Henderson in my program today. Emma began her career as an airline captain. She went on to become one of the fewer than 500 female airline captains in the world, flying passenger jets for one of Europe's largest airlines. Then she founded Project Wingman, now a global charity, an initiative that offers rest and recuperation for thousands of NHS staff nationwide. She inspires audiences across the world, sharing her stories of leadership, resilience, decision making, and well being, offering audiences across the world the strategies, behaviors, and inspiration to break through challenges to reach their full potential. She has recently been shortlisted at the Speaker Awards in two categories: Best Storyteller 2024 and Best Newcomer 2024. She's also an author of a book, Grounded. In today's program, we'll talk about her life as a thought leader and about her book, Grounded. Emma, welcome to the Ink and Insights with Sumit Sharma Samir.
Thank you very much. What a lovely welcome. And I just need to update you, actually, because I became highly commended in Best Storyteller at the Speaker Awards last year. But actually this year, I won the prize as Booker's Choice at the Speaker Awards. So I came away with a trophy. So that was last year's awards, and this year was even better.
Right. Congratulations, Emma, on that. Emma, I mean, you have had a very remarkable journey as a commercial pilot, as far as I have come to learn about your life. But what inspired you to take to the skies in the first place?
Well, I think I was always, as a child, I always was fascinated by things that flew, and particularly birds. So I used to come up on holiday to Scotland, where I now live, and watch ospreys at a place called Botegarten, where in the 1970s you could become a young ornithologist, which was the youth part of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds.
Wow.
There's a young ornithology club. So I joined that. So I was always fascinated by things that flew. And then as I got older, those things, I learned more about things. And then when I was 10 years old, the Space Shuttle Enterprise came to land on the back of a 747 at Stansted Airport, which was a small airport at the time with just a shed and a kind of grass strip down the side of the runway, not like the big international airport it is now. And I looked up and thought, I want to fly one of those. And I was talking about the space shuttle and not the 747 that it had landed on the back of. So that kind of sparked the flame, or that was the spark, and that kind of grew into, more fascination into things that fly. But the thing is that flying wasn't very accessible to me because I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know where to even start. And everybody who was alive in the 1970s and 1980s will remember that all the information that we had in the world about everything came in a book about, that thick, called the Encyclopedia of the World. And it started with cavemen and it went through to space flight and had everything in between. And we didn't have access to information like we have now. So it wasn't a case of I want to go and fly, so I'll go and fly. I had to take quite a few steps in that journey.
But aviation remains very much a male-dominated industry. What were some of the biggest challenges you faced as a woman pilot, and how did you overcome them?
Well, it is still a very male-dominated industry. So if you want some statistics, 6% of the world's pilots are women, and that includes general aviation. And when you come to commercial aviation, that narrows to about 4.5%. So it's not there aren't very many female pilots at all. But when you then talk about captains, so the person that's in charge of the aircraft, that's where the numbers get really small. And that's where the 500 number comes from. So some people say it's now 800, but it's difficult. There aren't very accurate statistics on it, but it's estimated to be about between 500 and 800 female airline captains in the world. And actually the challenges I faced didn't come from the men I was working with. They came from myself, because actually I put pressure on myself to want to be good enough to be in the same room as all the men without realizing that I already was good enough to be there. But I put that pressure on myself. I never, ever had this sort of challenge. I never had a challenge from any male colleague challenge me about why I was there and what I was doing. The only comments I ever really had were about the fact that I, at the age of 36, I'd left my children at home in Scotland and moved down to my parents' house when I was working. I mean, I didn't move. I stayed with them when I was working, but I basically left them 600 miles away to go and do a job that I wanted to do. But ultimately, that was a job that brought stability to our family as well. So, it was a double-edged sword. But I think most of the barriers are often the ones we put in front of ourselves.
True. And Emma, can you recall a particular defining moment during your flying career that kind of shaped your outlook or values?
Yeah, I think there are a couple really, and I think the first one of those was that I spent the first 4 or 5 years of my airline career thinking that if I didn't turn up to work, the airline would just stop operating, and I was essential to the running of the airline. So I worked really, really hard, as you would expect, but I probably worked a bit too hard, and I might have prioritized work over my health. I say might, I definitely prioritized work over my health, and I didn't really give myself time, enough downtime to recover, because it's quite punishing. As a short haul, low cost pilot, you are working long hours every day, and you go 1 week, you start at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the following week you don't finish till 3 o'clock in the morning. So your body clock is always out of sync. So actually, I didn't really respect that enough. And I still wanted to, be young and active and sporty and play tennis and run and things like that. And eventually, I just got to a point where my body decided to pack in, basically. And I started to fall over for no reason that I could put my finger on. And I ended up with an autoimmune triggered neurological disorder that killed me. So, it wasn't something that was easy to detect. It took quite a lot of testing, and it took quite a lot of understanding by experts to know what was going on with my body, and also to know that there was a fix for it. So I was very lucky because there was a cure. Right. And that cure was a week of immunotherapy, basically. But, I really think that came about because I'd worked too hard. And two things happened there, really. Firstly, I was very lucky to survive. So my neurologist thought I had about 3 days left before I died when I went into hospital. No. So I was and at the time I didn't feel like I was going to die. But afterwards, I realised how serious it had been. And the other thing that was that my dad said to me, never let the thing you're doing become more important than the reason that you're doing it again. And I thought that was quite profound, really. But it was the realization that I'd nearly not had a life. And if there was also a risk that full recovery would have meant being in a wheelchair. That gave me a lot more gratitude about the life I have, and a lot more drive to achieve as much as I can with the life I've got left, which I hope will be very long. I've made a full recovery. There's no chance really of that coming back. So it's not something, it's not like cancer where there's always a worry that it might recur. It's something that has been treated and it's gone. So I can kind of put that behind me, but it took a long time to do things. So trusting my legs to go down steps again was quite a big deal. It took me quite a long time to trust my body again, but it was a really defining moment for me because it made me appreciate life itself. But it led on to what happened next, which was that I rushed back into everything too quickly. And one of those things was being desperate to become a captain. And of course, if you're not in the right place to do a big thing like that, then it's not going to end well, is it? So I ended up putting myself forward for that too quickly. And it's a long story that I cover in the book, but ultimately I failed. And I didn't become a captain the year I wanted to. I failed at 2 o'clock in the morning. I knew I'd failed. The debrief was reasonably short, and I managed to hold it together during the debrief. But, it was raining. Of course it was raining for the drive home. And I drove home in the pouring rain crying because I felt so ashamed that I had failed at something, and I knew I could have done it differently. So, those two things were really big defining moments in my career, because the first one taught me that actually your job is not more important than your life. And the second one taught me that actually you can face failure and it doesn't define you, it refines you. And I think there's that one little letter, the D to the R, defining rather, it doesn't define you, it refines you. So these challenges that we face in our careers, in our personal lives, globally, we might be kind of very sensitive to the sort of turbulence we're facing in a world that is frankly on fire.
Right.
Those kind of challenges don't define us if we choose to act in a certain way. We can choose to own those things and we can choose to learn from them. And that's what refines us and makes us go on to be better versions of ourselves.
Absolutely, Emma. I simply love that statement. Those challenges doesn't define us, but rather refine us. I mean, it's a very profound kind of things to keep, pushing her to kind of achieve things in life, right? But the way you came out of all those things is really impressive, Emma. And also, you were awarded an MBA for services to aviation and charity. How did it feel to be recognized with such a prestigious honor?
Well, it had never crossed my mind that something like that might happen. When we set the charity up in 2020, that was a response to staring into the abyss of not knowing what was going to come next for us as aircrew. And for me personally, I was also staring into that abyss. And I think people probably forget that because I led the charity and because I was the face of the charity, I think people forget that actually it started because I came home from a flight, came home for my days off, and I thought, what am I going to do now? I needed to be useful. I needed to be needed. So it came from that as well. So actually, when I set the charity up, it was all about just getting the work done and making sure that we were doing everything we needed to make sure the people who were volunteering, and we had 6,500 people volunteering for us by July 2020, to make sure they all got what they needed. So, they had the right information, they had the right equipment, they had the right connections, they had the right phone numbers, that they knew what they were supposed to be doing, they knew when they were supposed to be doing it, all of those things. That was the nuts and bolts of the work. So when in November 2020, I received an email during a meeting from Downing Street informing me that I had been nominated to receive an MBE and would I like to accept it? Because you don't have to accept it. You can choose to turn it down, and some people do. Okay. And I read it and I thought, this has got to be a joke. I thought it was somebody playing tricks. So I had to read it a few times before I could believe it. And because it was COVID, normally that would happen by letter and then all sorts of things would happen. But because it was COVID, it was an email that I received. I responded by email. I wasn't allowed to tell anybody because you're sworn to secrecy. So I wasn't allowed to tell anybody. And that was really difficult. I mean, I told my husband and I said, you can't tell anyone. And I told one other person, which was my media manager. And I said to her, you're going to get very busy around New Year. I'm really sorry. And she said, yes, I know. I was one of the people who nominated you. So, so it was just amazing, really, to think that the work, the 18-hour days that I'd been putting into the charity and the relentless work that had gone into it and the belief that it was the right thing to do had paid off. And for me, it was about giving recognition to the charity, because I knew that by putting myself out there into the media as a recipient of the MBE, I knew that would shine a spotlight on the charity. And we needed publicity. So I just put myself out there and said, so every interview, every broadcast, every meeting, and I went on Sky News and I was on the BBC and I met Boris Johnson and I was introduced to all these people online, and all of that stuff was just so that the charity could be more prominent.
Right. Emma, and it's very interesting to kind of also explore the other side of you, which is kind of what led to your transition from flying planes to grounding your feet, both literally and metaphorically, with the writing of your book, Grounded.
Yeah, well, basically when 2020 happened and the bottom fell out of our worlds and we all came to a standstill. I was obviously working really hard on the charity, and then I got the MBE, and I was actually reading what prompted the actual writing of the book was reading another book. But during 2020, walking around the woods with my husband and the dogs on numerous occasions, I started to have conversations with him about whether or not I was going to go back to flying, because I was really enjoying being at home here. So I live 600 miles north of Gatwick, which is where I was based, and I was having to commute. So I would fly down at 6 o'clock in the morning, go back to bed for a few hours, and then operate a flight to Malaga or wherever. And that worked, but I was getting tired, and I was also becoming menopausal. So I probably had gone into my menopause a couple of years before, but it was starting to show. And I just started to think, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. So we'd had all those conversations, and then the company offered voluntary redundancy, and I decided to take it. So I'm now kind of, a year into not having flown. I've got my MBE. I've left my job. I'm the CEO of this big charity that's making a big difference in the NHS, but also it was making a big difference to aircrew, because as we went in and out of lockdown, I think we went into 4 or 5 different lockdowns in the UK in 2020 and 2021. And so I was busy doing all of that. And I read this book. It's quite a controversial book now, actually. It's called The Salt Path, and they've just made it into a film, and there's been quite a lot of controversy over the author. But I was reading The Salt Path, and my husband had read it, and he said, "You know what? Your story's better than that. I think you should write it down."
Right.
I thought, well, I don't know if my story's better, but certainly I get what you're saying. It's an interesting story, because just becoming a female pilot in the first place with 3 small children is something a lot of people don't do. And I tend to be that person that does things that a lot of people don't do. So he said, why don't you just write it down and see what happens? So I did. I started to just, think about how I was going to put down my experiences into a book. And I met up with a guy, a guy I'd been at university with, put me in touch with an agent who loved the idea, and he kind of set the framework for how I was going to write it. And that business relationship didn't actually work out, but I ended up with a manuscript and an introduction to a publisher from a school friend of my husband's, and the publisher loved it and said, brilliant, I'll publish it. So there we were, May last year, May 2024. My book Grounded was published. They've got a copy of it here, got a copy of it behind me. I really love it. It was very, very important to me that the book looks and feels nice. I don't want to have anything with my name on it that doesn't look good. So it's really my story into, through and out of aviation and what I went on to do next. So it's not a leadership manual. You're not going to read Grounded and come away with a new way of running your business, but there are a lot of leadership stories in there that people have got a lot of value from. So it's a story, but it's a valuable story. It teaches lessons, and that's what people take away from it.
तिमीसँग अब धेरै टाइम छैन है, बिहे गर्नु छ भने गरिहाल, नत्र घरबाट मलाई अन्त्य बिहे गर्दिनु। भर्खर 3 वर्ष भयो एमबीबीएस जोइन गरेको, 5 वर्षको कोर्स हो। के भो? अचम्म छ। एक्सक्यूज मी सर मेरो 5 वर्षको कोर्स 3 वर्षमा सकाउन मिल्दैन? गेट आउट। हेलो, के सोच्यौ त? के सोच्ने? मैले प्रिन्सिपलसँग पनि कुरा गरिसके। 3 वर्षमा पनि के हुन्छ? के हुन्छ 3 वर्षमा?
के भयो भाइ? ल बस। साउजी, एक कप चिया। कसले भन्यो 3 वर्षमा के हुँदैन भनेर? यो हेर, एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजनामा 3 वर्षमा पैसा फिर्ता हुन्छ।
ए हो र?
जीवन बीमाको साथमा धनवृष्टि 3 वर्षमा एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजना। एलआईसी नेपाल।
Warm services to delight your senses, taking hospitality to newer heights. Nepal Airlines.
Emma, and then, the title of the book itself, Grounded, is both literal and symbolic. Can you unpack the layers of meaning behind it?
Yeah, well, it was difficult to choose the title. So when I first wrote the book, its working title was called Folding My Wings, because I had written a post on LinkedIn in September 2020 when I had taken voluntary redundancy. It was my way of saying goodbye to EasyJet and thanking people for the support they've given me along the way, which still makes me feel quite emotional when I think about it. But I had written a post on Workplace, which was the company's intranet, and on LinkedIn, just saying, folding my wings, and just saying, after all these years, I've decided it's time to fold my wings, and it's been a wonderful journey, blah, blah, blah. And it went viral. It was like, I think I had 140,000 views in something like 10 hours or something. And it was a really popular post. So I called the book Folding My Wings to start with. But when we came to publish it, lots of people said, well, actually, it sounds like you've died. It sounds like it's being released posthumously. So it didn't have quite the right fit. And grounded, I wanted it to be one word, really. And grounded was given to me really by another speaker who had read something that she sent me, and she highlighted it and she said, this describes you perfectly. And it was an article she'd read about the idea of being grounded, which involves the three sort of pillars of humanity, humility, and humor. And she said, I just think it describes you perfectly. And it just a light bulb moment for me, because that's when I realized that should be the title of my book, because I have been grounded by my own choice. But also as a person, I like to think I'm a fairly grounded person. I don't tend to get very hysterical about things. I tend to be quite practical. I tend to keep my feet on the ground. And if I ever don't have my feet on the ground, my 3 adult children are very good at reminding me where I belong. So, that's where the title came from. And I think, in life generally, yes, I'm grounded as a pilot, but that's by my own choice. I can go back flying if I want to, and I probably will. But, as a person, you can choose how you treat people. And in a world that, as I said earlier, in a world that's on fire, we need to choose humanity. We need to remember to see people as human beings over and above everything else. And we need to choose humility, because actually when a spotlight shines on any member of our team, it lights up the whole room. So It's not about the gongs and medals that we can get personally. And I'm very clear about, me having the MBE is wonderful, but it belongs to every single one of the 6,500 people who got out of bed every day when they didn't have to and did something for people they didn't know. It's a joint effort. So it has my name on it, but it belongs to everyone. And I think that's really important, to have that to have enough humility to understand that, I was the person that was the leader, but if there weren't people who were doing the job, I'd have nothing to lead. And I think that it would be good for some leaders in the world to remember that you might be leading something, but if nobody's on board with what you're saying, you're not leading anything.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you, Emma, that we got to be grounded in terms of understanding that philosophy behind leadership and leading as well. But I was wondering, were there any stories or chapters in your book you found particularly difficult to write due to their emotional weight or personal significance?
There were, really. I mean, the chapter about leaving EasyJet and making that decision, that was a really difficult decision. And there were lots and lots of reasons why I made that decision in the end. It's never just one thing, is it? But, that was a very emotional time for me, because I lost my identity. I walked away from the career that I'd become known for, because I had been on an ITV documentary called Inside the Cockpit. And I was known as Captain Emma. Captain Emma was who I was. That was who everybody knew who I was. So, people would come up to me, out of work and say, hi, it's Captain Emma, isn't it? Or more usually they'd say, you're that pilot off the telly, aren't you? And I'd say, yes. I'm quite happy to be known. But even now I get called that pilot off the telly and can I have a selfie,
Right.
So, I thought when I left EasyJet that I would lose that identity. And I haven't done, because actually I've turned it into what I do now. But it was difficult to write about that, because I was writing about walking away from a lot of years of hard work and a lot of years of other people believing in me and a lot of years of other people doing things around me so that I could go and do the job. So that was very hard. And I think the other chapter that was hard really was, or the two chapters were the story around my command failure and my illness, because, you know, I did nearly die. And I think it was sobering to write that down on a piece of paper. And there were parts of the book that I read as I wrote them, you know, just after I wrote them, and I read now and they make me cry because they're sad, you know, and there are bits that it's quite an emotive book, but it's also funny. So, you know, it's not designed to pull people down and make them feel sort of like the world is going wrong. It's designed really to show you that no matter what happens, there's always something that comes, you know, along as a result of all the decisions we make. And I talk about it in terms of pushing on doors. So, you know, you've got to push on doors to see if they'll open. But sometimes, and then when the door opens, you've got to be brave enough to walk through it if you've pushed on it. Sometimes the door won't open and you have to walk away from it. It's not meant for you. But sometimes doors can't open until others have closed. And I think that's really important as well, that, you know, there's no way I could have gone on to do the job I do now if I was still flying all the time, because you can't focus on two things at the same time and be really good at both of them.
Right. Right, absolutely, Emma. And you are a trailblazer in both aviation and charity work. What advice would you give to young women pursuing leadership in unconventional fields?
Well, I think that now is the time to be talking about that, isn't it? Because now is the time that we're realizing that actually, if you don't include women, actually, it's not even about women. If you don't include anybody who's not traditionally a white man in leadership, you're missing out on all the talent that those people can bring to the table. So as not just as a woman in leadership, but as a non-white man in leadership, you know, if you are anything other than that, you have a valuable piece of the pie to bring to the table. And I think that instead of, we mustn't think about it in terms of getting in our own way and thinking, well, I've got nothing relevant to say. I don't look like those people, or those people don't look like me. How can I compete? We just have to be ourselves. And, you know, one of my favorite singers is Taylor Swift. And she says, you know, if they don't like you for being you, be more you. So if you are a woman or if you are anything in leadership that's not the traditional model of what leadership looks like, be more you. Because actually we don't need more people that all look the same and all say the same things and all dress the same and all go to the same golf club in the same car. We need people that bring different perspectives, because that's how we grow and learn. That's how we look at things through different lenses, and that's how we see problems differently, which helps us to solve them. It's simple. It's so simple that we've all overlooked it.
Right. That's very profound for me, Emma. Be more of yourself is kind of, you know, generally people want to follow some other footsteps, right? But becoming yourself is rather more important.
Well, I think if you look at all the traditional great leaders throughout history, whether it's, you know, Jesus, Muhammad, you know, more recently people like maybe Winston Churchill, they might not be the person that you want to follow, but you know, all the big leaders in history who've really stood out have been different. They've all said something different from everyone else. They've all done something differently from everyone else. And I think that's, you know, you don't become a leader by doing what everyone else is doing. That's a follower.
Absolutely. Quite agree with you, Emma. And looking back, is there anything you would have done differently in your career or in personal journey?
Well, I mean, I don't really spend too much time thinking about things like that because I can't change it now anyway. Right. But I think the thing I would have probably said to myself when I was younger is just get out of your own way. You're good enough. You can be here. You know, if you're in the room, you're entitled to be there. So if you can manage to get yourself into the room, then you're already qualified to be there. So your voice is valid. And I suppose the only other thing is to remember, which is ironic given that I've just done most of the talking in this podcast, But to remember that listening is a more powerful skill than speaking. And I think, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I think it's important to use them in that proportion.
Right, right, absolutely. Listening is rather very important. I mean, even for, for hosts who conduct podcasts, it's more important to prioritize your guest. And that kind of give a sense of learning as well. I mean, it teaches you quite a lot of things.
I think when you listen as well, you hear things that you hadn't realized before. And I think that's the gift of it, really.
Absolutely. How do you maintain balance and resilience in a life that has been marked by both high altitude adventures and deep introspection, Emma?
Well, I think some people would say I haven't. I think my husband's children would say there's no balance there at all. But actually, there is. And when I was flying, I was very lucky because my airline was not allowed to contact me on my days off. So as soon as I checked out after a day of flying, I was on my way home and I wasn't allowed to receive a phone call or an email or anything from my employer until I checked in the next time. I had to make sure I was up to speed with everything. So it was my responsibility to make sure that I did look at messages and things, but they weren't allowed to contact me. So my days off were really quite well protected. And that was really lovely because you could really go from, there's a chapter in my book called Captain Mummy. So I was describing the bit where you get in you leave home having wiped cornflakes off your top because your children have spilled them on you or something like that. And then, you transition from the madness of the early morning, getting everyone out to school and work. And in the car, that's where I would transition to, for me, it would be going to an airport to go down to London to work. But that's where I would switch from the emotional Emma to the steely-eyed professional Emma who understood that the decisions I was making had 180 people's lives depending on them. So I couldn't get emotional about those things, even when they were emotive. So, times when there was a fight on board one of my aircraft when I pulled onto stand in Gatwick and people got injured and there was a little child clinging to my leg saying, "Save us, Captain, save us." And I couldn't get emotional about that. I had to be really professional about it to make sure the problem went away, to make sure we dealt with the problem. So, part of the balance comes from that sort of reset time between when you're the at-home mummy or daddy or whoever you are to the at-work person. And the waters become muddied then when you're working from home all the time. And when I first set the charity up, my desk was on the landing upstairs in this house outside my bedroom. So when I got up in the morning, I walked past my desk. And when I went to bed at night, I walked past my desk. And of course, I would get distracted. And I would sit down to answer one email. And then 3 hours later, it would be 2:00 in the morning and I'd be still working. So I'm quite fierce now about, this office has a door that I close on it at the end of the day. I try and do something in the morning that isn't work, that transitions me between being at home and being at work. And I try and draw that line very fiercely so that my work life is my work life and my home life is protected so that my personal life doesn't get impacted too much by the work I do. But there are always times when, you've spent an afternoon at the beach because it's nice weather and then you have to work in the evening to catch up. So, that's the balance, isn't it? And I prefer to think of it as work-life harmony rather than work-life balance, actually.
Right. And my last question for today's program, what do you hope your legacy will be, not only as a pilot or an author, but as a person?
Well, as a pilot, I think that I've already left a legacy behind, which is the legacy of the numbers of people who've told me that they've become pilots because they've seen me on TV and realised that you don't have to look a certain way to fly a plane. So I like to think that the work I continue to do in that space will be valuable and that it will continue to encourage people to take up flying who otherwise might not have done. So that's the flying legacy. The book is something that's going to be there forever, So if you've got a copy, don't give it to a charity shop. Pass it on to someone else to read that you know. And it's just there forever to tell people, what a girl from Essex who didn't come from a flying background went on to achieve. So it's proof that ordinary people can go on to do extraordinary things. Mm-hmm. But as a person, I want to leave, I want to leave the world better than I found it. And I'm not going to change the world. I'm not going to become world famous and start to, rule things or anything like that. That's not my MO. But I do want to make sure that everywhere I am, I'm making a difference. Because if I make a difference in my small corner of the world, that ripples out and it affects everybody that it touches. And if we all do the same, I talk about it really as the atmosphere you bring to work. The atmosphere becomes the climate becomes the culture, and we can affect that in our own houses, the way we treat people, in our own villages or towns, the way we treat people in our jobs. And that ripple effect goes on and does the rest of the work for you.
That's very profound, Emma. I'm sure that message would be carried to different other people as well through our platform. But honestly, thank you so much for your time. I'm really honored to have you in my platform. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real privilege to speak to you. I wish I'd had time to find out more about you. It's all been about me, and it should have been about you as well.
Well, I mean, I'm hosting you, so it has to be you today. Perhaps some other time we'll catch up.
I'll be the host, and you can come on my podcast. And if anybody's watching this who would like to know more about some of the things I've spoken about, I do work as a professional speaker. So I come into businesses and I give talks on the things I've done and the leadership lessons I've learned. And that's something that, it is possible if you're interested, having watched this.
Definitely, Emma.